we're going to start with Jonah chapter 1 and verse 4, and we're on slide 7 of the PowerPoint, the second PowerPoint this morning. That's where we're going to start. When we finished the session yesterday in the morning, we were looking at the first 3 verses of chapter 1 and considering how they frame the narrative, what information they give, what information they assume, and how that in some way prepares us for the entire narrative that is to follow. When we come to verses 4 through 6, we shift out of the initial interaction between Yahweh and Jonah and his sort of refusal to accept the commission in a certain sense. And we now begin to explore Yahweh's response to what Jonah does. And so Yahweh, having given the oracle and the commission to Jonah in verses 1 through 3, now responds to Jonah's refusal to, as it were, carry it out, and his sort of very active sort of opposition to Yahweh's plan when it comes to Nineveh. Now, in Hebrew, you have sort of a dominant word order where you have verb followed by either object or subject, as the case may be. So it's a verb-prominent kind of language. When you look at verse 4, however, you'll find that the subjects begin. And this is a kind of device that gives prominence to the subjects, but it also can signal that we're not so much into sort of moving the narrative along as we're sort of providing background information. And this is a device that you find used in Hebrew narrative to try to sort of say, well, we've had this period of intense interaction in verses 1 to 3. Now we're going to shift and provide sort of the filling in of stuff until we come to the next significant action in verse 5 and so forth. And so in verse 4, we have several statements. First of all, that Yahweh hurls, a very, again, active verb, a very dramatic verb, hurls this great wind. And then we read about the ship that was thought to or was about to break up. And so you jump very quickly from Jonah's fleeing and getting on board the ship and so forth into this response, a very dramatic response from Yahweh. It is also possible that the way in which the Hebrew is structured almost expresses the actions in verse 4 as results. And you could read it, and so Yahweh hurled. And as a result, the ship was in danger and so forth in regards to that. But the outcome is that we have the 2 primary protagonists, Jonah and Yahweh, now joined, as it were, in this contest. And who is going to win? What is going to be the outcome in terms of this great interaction? The third clause in verse 4 indicates that, again, the ship is the thing that's going to be sort of at play in this interaction between Jonah and Yahweh. And destruction is the presumed outcome given the immensity of the storm that Yahweh produces. So from chapter 1, verse 1 down to the end of verse 4, we've got the framework for the whole plot in the narrative. And the 2 primary characters now are interjoined, and we are trying to figure out what is going to happen. And so even though Yahweh acts in this very dramatic way, we're going to find that he does not give up on Jonah. And as you saw in the Psalm in chapter 2, Yahweh acts again. He not only sends the great storm, he sends the great fish, and he's going to then send the vine and so forth. He's always interacting in human history in order to, on the one hand, bring Jonah along into alignment with his will, but also to make sure that his plans are indeed accomplished. We might ask, why is Yahweh so persistent with Jonah? Sort of what's at stake? And of course, there are many stories in the Old Testament that demonstrate Yahweh's persistent with human agents who are not always happy to go along with his direction. We think of his interaction with Israel in the wilderness and how often they grumble and complain, and yet Yahweh comes back and he responds and he's gracious and so forth. But there are always limits, it seems, to what Yahweh will tolerate when it comes to human opposition or rebellion, as the case may be. And it's interesting how far Jonah here can push, as it were, the limits of Yahweh's patience, and Yahweh still responds and preserves and doesn't obliterate him in that perhaps easier kind of a response that could be the case. One of the things, too, that, moving on to the next slide here, is that in the Hebrew text, the paragraphing is a little bit different than what you find in, say, the NIV. If you look at the NIV in the first 6 verses, you'll notice that there are 4 or 5 different paragraphs that are structured. And again, this is an attempt on the part of the translation to sort of segregate different pieces of the action and make clear how things are working together. In the Hebrew text, however, we only have 2 paragraphs. First paragraph is verses 1 to 3, and the second paragraph is verses 4 to 6. And so the Hebrew text sort of, as it were, segments the text in a different way and sort of clusters the activity around different focuses and so forth. I mention that because sometimes as we look at the NIV, the way the paragraphing is structured does sort of lead us to assume certain things about how the text is meaning. And so sometimes it's good to check. And if you don't know Hebrew, an easy way to do that is to use something like the New Revised Standard Version, which is a more literal sort of text that reflects more closely the structure of the Hebrew than the NIV does, which is more of a dynamically constructed translation, giving more attention to accommodation to the English than the NRSV does. So if you want a quick check to see, okay, well, how is the paragraphing going, you can always check something like the NRSV as a way to try to determine that. One other minor thing just to note is that there's one other paragraph in chapter 1, and that goes from verses 7 to 16. So the whole interaction that ensues between Jonah and the sailors and the captain and so forth is construed as one whole unit. So chapter 1 is really, in the Hebrew text, composed of 3 units. Initial interaction between Jonah and Yahweh, and then Yahweh's sending of the storm, and then in verses 7 through 16, the actions of the sailors and their interaction with Jonah. But we're not quite sure where to end this third paragraph. The Masoretic text ends at verse 16 and then begins chapter 2 with what is verse 17 in our English translations. And so again, there's a slight difference. Is verse 17 the end of the third paragraph, or is it the beginning and the introduction to the psalm, where the fish here is introduced and so forth? So again, some minor differences, but they can generate some important interpretative issues as you think about what the text means and how to interpret it. Well, we talked a little bit about miracle yesterday, but again, the arrival of the storm again forces us to come back to that question because this is a supernatural intervention and is in line with, as we indicated yesterday, many other places in the Old Testament where Yahweh will use meteorological phenomena in order to accomplish his purposes. Whether it's the crossing of the Red Sea or the flood in the case of Noah, or the great plague of locusts in Joel that signifies God's judgment. God is always using these sort of natural events. You think about the plagues in Egypt and so forth in order to accomplish his purposes. And often what we would call a natural phenomenon gets enhanced in terms of its intensity or its, proportionality, because Yahweh is determined to accomplish something. And so here you'll notice that in the text in verse 4, it's a great wind, it's a mighty storm, it's threatening the ship and so forth. And as you read through verses 7 and following, nothing the sailors can do is going to preserve the ship, despite all of the knowledge that they have as sailors about surviving storms, and I don't imagine this was the first one that they experienced. Nonetheless, nothing that they do can in any way bring them to safety. The storm is too great. And so here again, the nature of the description of the storm and so on and so forth gives us a sense that behind it is a personality that is determined to accomplish something. And no matter what human agency seeks to do, it is ineffective. It's impotent in the face of things. So we move on then to verses 5 and 6 and so forth, and the response of the sailors. We talked a little bit about sailors yesterday. I presume that these are probably Phoenician sailors who are in charge, but obviously from the description and encouragement for each sailor to cry out to their own God, presumably there are different ethnicities involved, whether they were slaves or whether they were what we would call employees and so forth. We're not sure. The text doesn't tell us. But presumably the captain and those that were in charge of the vessel were Phoenicians, and the others were either Phoenicians or other ethnic groups. But they have a certain understanding of things, and we discover here that as the storm comes along and so forth, Jonah is interacting here with a group of non-Israelites. Now, these seasoned sailors, as you can see in verse 5, became afraid. And one could ask the question, okay, if these are, as it were, seasoned sailors and accustomed to storms, what generates their fear? And presumably, again, it's the immensity of the storm, the severity of the storm. They realize that this is no ordinary storm. And as a result, their immediate, response is to cry to his God. That's what they do. So here is an interesting thing to think about. In the Old Testament, the idea of fearing Yahweh is a major theme. It's a way of describing, on the one hand, worship. The people of Israel feared Yahweh. They worshipped him. They respected him. On the other hand, it can be used of any person who is, as it were, caught in the hands of Yahweh in a judgmental situation. And it's a fear that is, as it were, paralyzing fear, because they realize the power of Yahweh and so forth. And presumably here, the response of the mariners to the storm is not a fear that is worshipful, but it is a fear that is saying, I am terrified, right? This is an unusual storm and it's not looking good, and death is staring us in the face. And so what's the ultimate remedy? You cry out to your God. And this is how things then get set up. They do what they can practically. They jettison the cargo in order to lighten the ship and so forth. As we showed you on the picture yesterday, presumably this was a ship that had a sail, had oars, and that kind of thing. That was the only power that they had. And in a storm of this nature, the sail would be useless. And probably the rowing capacity would be limited because the ship is being tossed up and down on waves, and the ability of the oars to capture the water and empower the boat is probably fairly limited. And then you have the rudder, the big rudder that presumably the captain or one of the chief crew people was managing in order to steer the vessel. That's what they had. And so either they lighten the ship in order to prevent it from being overwhelmed with waves and swamped and so on and so forth, or try to do something else in order to get free of this storm. When you read the story in Acts 27:28 of Paul's journey to Rome and the storm that encompassed the vessel he was on, it's interesting that the same kind of actions are described. In other words, this was common response to a storm of this nature. And even the value of the cargo, the whole purpose of the voyage is, how shall I say, not sufficient for the sailors to try to sustain it, and they throw it overboard regardless of what it was. So while all of them then are engaged in this very frenetic activity, what is Jonah doing? And so this is what the next verse indicates to us, the last part of verse 5. Jonah had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. Now, you shouldn't think of sort of these ships of having kind of modern cruise liner suites or anything of that nature. It was probably pretty rough and ready, and he was probably in the cargo hold. But it's surprising that nonetheless he was sleeping, presumably dry, and so forth. The term used here to describe the nature of his sleep is kind of interesting because when the captain comes to arouse him and so forth, you'll notice in verse 6, it says, "What are you doing sound asleep?" And it's possibly the case that this verb is the same verb that's used when God puts Adam to sleep and is in the process of creating Eve, Genesis 2:21. It's a cognate term. And so the idea is of a very deep slumber. The Greek version suggests that he is in such a deep slumber that he's actually snoring. Whether or not that's the intent, nonetheless, it's a pretty colorful kind of expression. So this is Jonah's situation. Again, you'll notice the extremes. All right, the sailors, they're just doing everything they can to save their lives. They're calling out to their gods. They're throwing the stuff overboard. Noah's right out of the picture. Right, he's asleep. How could he do that? What is going on here in this way? And so I guess the sailors, they come and they tell the captain what's going on here with Jonah. And the captain then, verse 6, goes down and says, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." So the action now begins to shift back to Jonah because the captain is addressing him and so forth. And he appeals to Jonah to join in with the sailors in their prayers because from the sailors' perspective, they don't know which God is behind this, right? They're pagans. And each sailor has his own God, as it were. So which of these gods do we need to appease in order to preserve ourselves? So Jonah, come on, get going. Maybe it's your God that needs to be appeased in order to bring us safety. And so this is what then the appeal is. The pagan captain at this point doesn't see any differentiation between the pagan gods and Yahweh. He's just one God among many. But perhaps he is the one that holds the key to this. So as we think about this, what would be the captain's perspective about Yahweh? What does he know about him? We have nothing in the text to suggest that he has any awareness of Yahweh, any knowledge of Yahweh, only what Jonah might tell him, but Jonah hasn't said anything about his God. So the captain at this point is totally ignorant of Yahweh. All he sees him as is one of many gods. So this leads us then to the third paragraph, verses 7 through 16, where we have then the sailors coming to terms with their predicament and the action that leads them to throw Jonah into the sea. So the fear that is introduced in verse 5 again becomes the driving force for their actions in this situation. But it's interesting that when you come to verse 16, their fear of the storm has morphed into a fear of Yahweh. And so as you move from verse 5 and 6 down to the end of the third paragraph, verse 16, you get this interesting movement and development when it comes to an understanding of the fear of Yahweh. They give Jonah then an opportunity to respond and so forth. But we notice here that the sailors, verse 7, suggest another strategy in order to try to relieve things. And it's the strategy of casting lots so that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us. Now again, kind of get behind this text. What does this tell us about their view of divine and human interactions? What do you think?
It kind of seems like they have to do something, and then based on the results of what happens, they'll know, like, the divine activity, like that, how it coincides with it, yeah.
All right, but you'll notice that it says, we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us.
It's interesting. They almost have a more instinctively religious response than we do, right? So like we look like traffic or natural weather events, and we look for, probably just being modern people, look for a modern explanation, but they're instinctively religious. They're like, this certainly has to do with some deity. That has to be an explanation. And so they go and consult whatever medium they have to try and interpret what the occurrence has actually been caused by.
That's right. So they are what I would call, they operate with a supernatural worldview. The gods are present, and the gods are intervening in human interaction. Okay? But what about this idea of, on whose account this is happening? I'm pressing this a little bit, right? In my opinion, what this suggests to us is they believe that one of the sailors has done something to antagonize their God. And the God is reacting in this way to punish or in some way to drive this sailor, this person, to remediate the situation, offer some sacrifice, do something to bring about appeasement. Now, we're used to sort of the Israelite situation where God, Yahweh, is angry, and Israel repents, and they sacrifice, and in some way they repair the relationship with Yahweh, right? And we often view that as kind of being a unique sort of understanding of the divine-human relationship. But here you get a sense that this kind of understanding of the divine-human relationship was fairly common. The gods can get angry because of how we act as human beings. But what is interesting to me is they don't know what it is they've done, right? In other words, the gods haven't revealed, okay, this is how you should live, this is how you should act, and when you transgress one of these things, then this is what's going to happen, and so on and so forth. It's kind of Who knows what we've done, right? But somebody's done something, so let's try to figure this out and deal with the culprit, or that guy can do something to appease his God and let's get out of this fix. But they don't know. They're in a state of ignorance because their gods haven't revealed, as it were, what the rules are. And so the only sort of response they have is this kind of lottery kind of thing. They cast lots. And hopefully the God who's responsible is going to indicate through the casting of lots who's responsible. But it's still not going to say why, right? Who's done whatever to bring the God's anger to bear upon them. But the idea of an angry God and the importance of humans placating that God is sort of built into the human response and the understanding of the divine-human relationship outside of the Israelite context. Right? So I find this kind of interesting because you see it, as was mentioned even today. Someone is experiencing some kind of suffering or something, God must be behind it. Why doesn't God alleviate it, right? But there's very little thought given to, well, if that's the case, what have you done to bring this upon yourself? Or we have the insurance companies talking about acts of God, right? But no explanation as to why God might act in this particular way. It's still a fairly common perception in our society, right? But here you find it, as it were, sort of written into the texture of the narrative. Somebody's done something that the gods are angry with, and so they have to be placated. So as this goes forward, Jonah is part of this exercise. And we find in verse 7, that the lot fell on Jonah. And again, is this accidental or is this something that God has engineered and so forth? And so they have to then say to Jonah, tell us why this calamity has come upon us. And we get this series of very short and intense questions. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What's your country? Of what people are you? Jonah, tell us the story. What's going on here? We need to know. So again, you've got sort of a very intense interaction here as the questions fly. And Jonah is put on the spot as to what he should say. And the response in verse 9 is interesting. He, first of all, defines his ethnicity. I am a Hebrew. And then he defines his religious affiliation. I worship Yahweh. Excuse me. The word Lord here in our English versions is Lord with capitals. And that always indicates the proper name Yahweh, as I'm sure you know. But he defines Yahweh as the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. Thank you. So here Jonah is beginning to explain a little bit of his theological understanding. This is the creator God. This is the one who's behind the storm. He made the sea. He made the dry land. Again, he is the one in charge. And again, this sets things up for chapter 2 with the fish and all that kind of stuff. If he's the creator God and he made the sea and everything else, he's the one that has the capacity to engineer all of these things. Now, there's a slight thing here just to be aware of that I note in the PowerPoint. Well, the Hebrew text talks about the fact that he is an Ivri, a Hebrew. The Septuagint text defines him as the slave of Yahweh. And the distinction in Hebrew is just with one letter. The Hebrew for slave of Yahweh would be Eved with a Daleth, not a Resh, with Yod at the end being the abbreviation for Yahweh. Whereas in the Hebrew text, it's Avri, Resh, with a final Yod indicating Ivri, Hebrew. So it raises the question, what was the original text, okay, is the translation of the minor prophets here done middle 2nd century BCE? Does it have a different Hebrew text? Or is it misreading the text? Because the difference between a Daleth and a Resh is very minor, right? And easily confused. And you have a number of situations in the Greek translation of the Old Testament where it misreads, presumably, the Hebrew text because of confusion. But if indeed the original text did read slave of Yahweh, that even generates more irony in the narrative, because what is this slave of Yahweh doing? Running away from his master, right? He's an escaped slave, and it puts an entirely sort of different flavor on what's going on in here. I'm not quite sure whether to put that into a sermon or not, right? Because it's just, it can be confusing. But on the other hand, it raises a really interesting perspective on the text in terms of, okay, what did Jonah actually say to these sailors, and how did he define himself? But we'll go with Ivri here because we're dealing with the Hebrew text and so forth. Okay, so as we think about these things then, we have this perspective, right? We see verse 10 then, that the men in the boat are even more afraid. And so again, we've got this fear thing coming, right? So they've heard the confession of Jonah. He's not told them what his occupation is. He hasn't told them, where do you come from, other than that I'm an Ivri. So maybe Ivri fills in a lot of that, and he doesn't have to say anything more. But in response, verse 10, it says the men were even more afraid. Now, you have to sort of ask the question, well, why? What is it about Jonah's confession that suggests that the God he is serving is a more serious contender than perhaps their gods? What generates this greater fear? Perhaps it is the confession that this is the creator God. This is the God of the sea. Maybe, this is not just the God of some city or the God of some sort of minor grove or something of that nature, some localized deity. This is the God who's responsible for everything, right? And even in the pagan pantheons, there's usually some chief god, right? In the Greek pantheon, you've got Zeus. And even though you've got many other sub-deities, Zeus he's the key. Right? And so perhaps the perspective here is that, okay, you worship the God who's really in charge of the whole heavenly pantheon. And so if that's the case, and he's after you, then we're really in serious trouble. And this is why they are more afraid, as it were. And so they ask him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them so. Now, one other small thing here that's important is that in our English text, in verse 9, Jonah has said, I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven. Now, of course, that word worship that's translated is the same Hebrew word for fear. I fear the Lord. So you begin to get a sense of how this verb to fear is being played upon in the narrative. The sailors are terrified at the storm. They become more terrified when Jonah reveals things. He describes himself as someone who fears Yahweh. The writer's playing on this idea of what does it mean to fear and so forth. Even with then Jonah's explanation of who he is and so forth, they really don't understand why have you done this, right? And what is it that they should do in response? And so verse 11, they ask the question, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? Now, again, one has to sort of think about the connections. What's going on in their minds as pagan sailors? How do they get from Jonah's confession that Yahweh is the one that he reverences, and so forth, to understand what do we have to do to you so that the sea will quieten down? They know that Jonah's actions are responsible for this. His God is doing this. So what are they going to do? It's no longer up to Jonah to do something, i.e. offer sacrifice or whatever, however he could do that in the middle of a storm. But the question is, how are we going to deal with you in order to cause this storm to abate? There's another word play here that's kind of interesting, and that is sort of, why have you done this, right? And that kind of language and so forth in verse 10, the verb asa. And then you turn around in verse 11, and what shall we do to you, asa? You have done something, now we need to do something, and so forth in that way. And so these are sort of the word plays that we have to pay attention to a little bit in this narrative. Now, in the midst of all this, verse 11, we find that the intensity of the storm is increasing. So nothing that they have done in verses 7 through 10 has in any way amended the situation. Excuse me. It's only gotten worse. And so this then sort of ramps up the situation and increases the urgency of the situation. Jonah's solution is interesting. He said, pick me up, verse 12, throw me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you. And so we have then Jonah indicating his understanding of what's gone on here. Now, as you think about this, Jonah is saying, you're going to have to kill me. You're going to have to sacrifice me, a human being, in order to escape from this storm. Now, human sacrifice is known in antiquity, and many of the Greek myths are about human sacrifice and so forth. And we read it in the Old Testament. The Canaanites are accused of human sacrifice and so forth. But it's not something that people would easily do. And there are all sorts of ramifications for killing a person in antiquity and so forth. But this is what Jonah says. Okay, you got to throw me overboard. You've got to sacrifice me as a human being in order to quell the storm. Human sacrifice. And in verse 10 and 12, then we find them thinking about this. And they initially reject it. You see in verse 13 that they keep rowing. All right, they're trying to bring the ship back to the land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. So what the narrator is doing here is saying, okay, they know what the solution is, but they don't want to do it. There's something that's preventing them from carrying this out. And so they try harder to resolve the situation, but the storm gets worse and worse and worse. So you've got this kind of vicious cycle that's going on here as the humans seek to get resolution, but the more they try, the worse it gets, and the only solution that they are given, they don't want to take. right? So the drama here is quite interesting to me as you think about it. And then in verse 14, you get sort of the resolution coming. But before we get there, let's think a little bit about how we should evaluate Jonah's solution that he gives in verse 12. Remember, it says, pick me up, throw me into the sea, and the sea will quieten down, and so forth. How will this solution enable the Ninevites to hear the oracle? If Jonah's gone, who's going to tell? Does Jonah actually get his way? He's wanting to flee. He doesn't want the oracle to be told. That, if they throw me overboard and I drown, is this sort of Jonah winning in the end? It's interesting to think about that. What was Jonah expecting to happen? And is Jonah realizing his sin and sort of accepting this as his punishment? Is this sort of, God's after me. I know I've done something wrong. I just have to put myself into God's hands because I deserve this? Is Jonah testing Yahweh? If Yahweh really wants this oracle to get to Nineveh and, I'm thrown overboard, does he anticipate that Yahweh's going to do something? We get no hint of a testing motif, but, you sort of wonder. And in the point of the story here, is Jonah the hero? Is he the villain? Is he something else? What is Jonah's place at this point in the story? And again, the narrator doesn't resolve that for us. He just sort of gives us the linear development of the activities and the raging storm and the doubts and the uncertainty of the sailors and their own internal turmoil at what's going on. And Jonah is sort of the hinge between those two things and what's going to happen, as it were. And what perhaps is surprising is that in verse 14, we find then the sailors crying out to Yahweh. So they're not appealing to their own gods anymore. Jonah's revealed who's responsible and what's happened. And so they cry out to the Lord, please, Yahweh, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. So they begin to make their appeal now to Yahweh. But they have a dilemma. If we throw overboard Jonah, is this going to make us guilty of killing a man who is innocent? This idea of innocent blood is a way of talking in the Old Testament about sort of the violation of a person who is innocent. Innocent blood. And if you destroy or kill a person who's innocent, that blood comes upon you, as it were. And you are held responsible by the deity for this unjust death. And so the sailors, they're worried that if they carry through what Jonah says, this is going to put them in jeopardy with Yahweh, because they will have taken a person's life who perhaps is innocent, and so forth. And so their appeal to Yahweh is, well, if this is what we have to do, then please do not make us guilty of innocent blood, because you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So again, think of the theology that's being expressed here by these pagan sailors. They realize that Yahweh is in charge. They realize that he is the one that is behind all of this. And he is the one that's doing as he pleases, right? And the sovereignty of God on all of those questions come into the text at this point, it seems to me, that have to be dealt with. Moving on here quickly. What theological framework would support non-Jews praying to Yahweh? Because this is what's going on here, right? They have no covenant relationship with Yahweh, as Israelites do, and yet they're praying to Yahweh and they're expecting him to hear and respond in some way. So how are we to understand sort of the relationship that is possible between Yahweh and non-Jewish people here? Any suggestions?
Well, it seems like there might be a pattern based on, the trajectory of Israel up to this point, where if people wanted to kind of adopt the Hebrew understanding of God and put themselves at His mercy, then God would spare them.
Right.
I think that the initial person who initiated that was Rahab. So this is kind of like a continuation of that sort of trend where, and even Yahweh tells the Israelites, hey, you need to be kind to foreigners. And He would not ask them to do something that He Himself
That's correct.
would not reflect His nature. So, I mean, their kind of recognition and their fear of Yahweh is probably the thing that I would say triggers His mercy to come upon them, because they're not saying no, we're not gonna believe that you are the God of heaven and earth.
Right.
We're gonna stick to our own beliefs. They're actually coming before Him. What's interesting, my question, because you mentioned the shedding of innocent blood, and this is maybe just my ignorance, was that a Jewish, a Hebrew thing in the Old Testament, or was that everybody had this idea that if you shed innocent blood, that's a big deal? Because the original place where that phrase came from was Cain and Abel.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm kind of asking the question, was innocent blood a big deal because all of a sudden they understand that they're dealing with Yahweh, or is it just everybody just had that understanding that innocent blood was a big deal?
I don't know about all of the religious perspectives in the ancient Near East. What I do know is that in ancient Greek religion, you do have stories where sort of innocent people are killed, and this generates a reaction on the part of the gods that finally occasions the death of the perpetrator and so forth, right? Because they have killed innocent blood. They have taken a life inappropriately and so forth. And so in Greek religion, there are processes for appeasing the gods when such a thing happens and that kind of thing. So it's not restrictive to Israelite understanding, but it's within Israelite perspective, how should I say, it reflects the concept of justice, all right, and that Yahweh is the protector of the innocent, the orphan, the widow, the person who is vulnerable, etc., right? So within Israelite frame of reference, it becomes a very important kind of idea. In Jeremiah, for example, his appeal to those that want to destroy him and kill him is, well, just be careful because you will be guilty of innocent blood, right? And you don't want innocent blood in your hands before Yahweh, because what will that do for you when it comes to accountability and that kind of thing? So it's a very significant threat in the context, at least, of Israelite religion, but in other religious spheres to some degree also. So forth. So, yeah, good.
Dr. Perkins,
Yes.
I think Jane had a comment or a
Okay,
question.
sure. Go for it.
I'm just thinking about the question you posed regarding the non-Jews coming to experience Yahweh. And I'm thinking that in terms of just the redemption plan that we will later see is the coming of Christ includes the Jews, the Gentiles. And so what I imagine is happening here is that the non-Jews have the capacity to experience God just as the Jews do.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one example of a time when God almost removes the veil
Mm-hmm.
for them for us actually to also see that God had the Jews or the heart of bringing in the Gentiles all along.
Sure. Yeah. Good. Time's going here, so I'm going to just stop the interaction here for a moment. It's interesting that when the temple is dedicated in 2 Kings chapter 8 and verses 41 to 43, in Solomon's prayer, he includes the opportunity for non-Jews to invoke Yahweh by looking towards the temple and praying. So, 2 centuries earlier, if you want to put it, there was also this idea that non-Jews could approach Yahweh through, as it were, the relationship that he had established with Israel, and they could invoke Yahweh, and Yahweh would hear and respond. But of course, as was indicated, there are many examples in the Old Testament of non-Jewish people entering into a relationship with Yahweh. Sometimes at the invitation of Jews, often without any kind of Jewish engagement at all. And it's interesting to look at those patterns and try to understand what was Yahweh's intention in those things. The other element here, it seems to me, is that as they respond to Yahweh in this way and pray to him and so forth for resolution, they recognize Yahweh's power. In other words, what did they have to acknowledge in their prayer for Yahweh to accept it? All right, you're the creator God, you're responsible for this storm, you're the one that's behind this. They had to have a certain fear of Yahweh, a certain respect of Yahweh, an understanding of his awesomeness as the basis for their prayer. And the idea that he would indeed respond to what they ask and so forth. That in some way his mercy and grace would respond to or correspond to his power. The other thing here, just to think about, is the narrator is sort of setting us up for Yahweh's response to the Ninevites in chapter 3. In other words, the pagan sailors pray to Yahweh and Yahweh responds. The Ninevites, they are going to respond to the oracle with repentance, and Yahweh is going to respond. So there's kind of a repetition of the action in chapters 1 and chapter 3 as you think about how pagans are responding to Yahweh. We're going to bring this to a conclusion here, just like the text does very quickly. Verse 16, then the men feared the Lord even more. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows. And all of this is in response to what happens in verse 15. They picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. So we have their response as it were going a second step. They've prayed, they've thrown Jonah into the sea, the storms abated, so what do? They make vows, they sacrifice, and they fear Yahweh even more, right? And so the growing realization of who Yahweh is and their relationship with him are expressed through the vows and the sacrifices. And vows and sacrifices are the normal way that Israelites maintain or establish relationship with Yahweh. You can read, for example, Psalm 116, verse 17 and following, and so forth. And it's possible that Jonah in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, in fact, follows a similar kind of activity and so forth. All of this then raises the interesting question How do humans deal with their sinful actions before Yahweh? And I think in this context and so forth, it's through acknowledging who he is, acknowledging sinfulness, and showing a repentant attitude through sacrifice, vows, and so forth. I don't know that they had any awareness of Israelite theology of sacrifice, but certainly in other religions of the day, the idea of offering sacrifice to appease the gods, to purify, these were common notions that were engaged around the ancient Near East. So, coming to verse 17 then, the Hebrew and Greek text continue with the narrative into verse 17. It's part of the scene's resolution. In response to the throwing Jonah overboard, the Lord provides a large fish to swallow up Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And that's sort of where the first part of the story comes to resolution. The first verb in verse 17, the Lord provided, has the idea of the Lord apportions, he allots, he sends. And this verb recurs in chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, when it translates, it's sort of talking about the bush that the Lord appoints, right? So this idea that Yahweh is organizing stuff, he's the one is doing as he pleases, is expressed in this language, and so forth. The last thing I would just note here is it's interesting to me in the Hebrew text of chapter, I guess it would be verse 17, and the Lord appointed a great fish. It talks about to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the midst of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, and so forth. This idea that Jonah is, in fact, now, as it were, in the hands of God. It's not the sailors who are responsible for his life or death, but he's now in the hands of God as he is in the belly of the great fish, because the Lord is providing it. The Lord is responsible. So we're going to stop there, take a brief break here for 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and look at a couple of things in chapter 3. On the PowerPoint, I've tried to outline here on the last slide some of the things that we might summarize out of this text. Yahweh reveals himself, some of his purposes to humans, and so forth. We realize the precarious situations of humans. Can you really ignore Yahweh? The chaos and disruption and fear that occur when humans ignore Yahweh. The senselessness of humans trying to thwart Yahweh's purposes. The consequences of human sin. And thinking about what Jonah's personal sin does to bring threat into the lives of these pagan sailors who are totally unrelated. In other words, sin is not just a personal matter, right? It has consequences. Fear, and the way that this word is used in different ways in terms of the narrative. Yahweh is the king of the universe, and how he uses its resources for his purposes. And within Yahwism, how prophecy is such an important way for him to reveal his activities and purposes and so forth. You might want to think a little bit of the relationship between prophecy and evangelism, whether these two things in Scripture are more intimately related than often is considered. All right, so we will take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll take a quick look at chapter 3. Okay?
Jane had posed a question earlier, and it was, why isn't understanding of paragraphing and a knowledge of the verbs important when engaging with the text? And should we always consider reading other prophetic texts? So I don't know if you want to answer that.
Sure.
Now,
Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. We can do that.
She's still online if you wanted to.
Who is it then?
Jane asked the question. Right
Jane.
there.
Okay, sure.
And Aaron was curious as well. So
Okay. Yeah, good question. It does impact other prophetic oracles and so forth, because the oracles are often in poetry, poetic form, as well as we can determine it. But sometimes you get prose materials that are interspersed. And it's not always easy to tell the relationship between the poetic materials and the prose materials within the prophetic books. And secondly, because of sometimes the obscurity of the prophetic oracles, it's not always clear when they end. Often there will be something to mark the beginning, some kind of formula, such as the prophet sees the vision, or the word of the Lord came to the prophet, or some kind of formula that marks the beginning. But exactly where it ends is a little more of a challenge. For example, when you look at Isaiah 40 to 55, you get these long, almost prophetic kinds of sermons that talk about Yahweh and what he's going to do. And it's difficult sometimes to know where they end and how they are to be segmented and so forth. So this is a challenge. I think the English versions do a great job normally in sorting that, but occasionally you do find places where there are questions about how best to understand sort of the flow of things within a particular oracle or oracular sermon or something like that. Does that help?
Michael.
It does, because prophetic books, I think partly why we don't tap into them in how we preach and teach is because of lack of clarity of where everything comes and the ebbs and flows, whether it's the prophet's experience to what the Lord is saying to what the Lord is doing. There's no clear break sometimes, and it just seems like just a long, almost like a supernatural experience that we can't relate to. But there is some wisdom in it, and I think that's where we need to, at least what I'm getting from this is that when we can break it up in chunks and be able to see how the thinking of the prophet, for example, then will be better placed to apply or see its relevance in our teaching and communicating the heart behind that prophetic message or that person's experience.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And in some cases, the prophetic writing will use the terminology to indicate beginning and ending. And so it will play with the language and introduce the concept at the beginning and then come back to it at the end. And you have a kind of what's called the inclusio situation, which can mark beginning and ending and so forth. I think that often is the way in which the prophet Isaiah sort of segregates sections in Isaiah 40 to 55. It's that kind of sort of wordplay by which we can say, well, now we're moving on to a new section or something of that nature. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think, and I'm thinking of it even in terms of the way Ezekiel is written, and why sometimes it's so hard to separate what the Lord is saying and doing from Ezekiel's own experiences to what we need to take away from that. Just an understanding of as you put it, the prose, the way the flow, just the way that the paragraphs are organized would give it more clarity.
That's true. And, the whole question of how you distinguish between poetry and prose in Hebrew is a kind of a vexed question also. You might want to look, for example, in Exodus 15, where you have the Song of Moses. In chapter 14, you've got the story about Israel crossing the Red Sea. And then in chapter 15, you have the Song of Moses celebrating all of that. And you have prose then followed by poetry.
Yeah.
And verses 1 to 18 then comprise so-called the Song of Moses. Well, you can see there a difference between the prose and the poetry by the way the poetic passage is structured and the parallelism and so forth, right? And it almost seems to be a different mode of speaking. And similarly in Jonah, when you go from chapter 1 to chapter 2 in the Psalm, you can tell that you're moving from narrative to poetry because of the way chapter 2 is structured and the parallelisms and so forth. But in some of the oracles, in the larger prophets, it's not always exactly clear where you're shifting from poetry to prose.
Yeah.
And in the English translation, for example, of Isaiah, sometimes they try to show the difference by the way the text is visually presented. And you'll see kind of a poetic passage and then a few verses of prose and then another poetic passage and so forth. And they're trying in that way to distinguish between what they regard is poetry in the Hebrew text and what seems to be prose in the Hebrew text. And it raises the question, okay, are we moving out of the oracle into something else? Or are oracles presented both as poetry and prose in a combined way? And those are sometimes challenging questions to answer. So, yeah.
What is the distinction between, we talked about this yesterday, but what is the key characteristics between an oracle and a prophecy?
I would say they are the same. I wouldn't think that they are to be distinguished. The term oracle might be focused more on the individual vision that's received or message, and prophecy is a more generic term that describes the phenomenon of divine revelation that comes to a person. But when you talk about a prophecy or an oracle, to my mind, those terms are synonymous. Okay? So when you talk about the prophecy of Jonah against Nineveh or the oracle against Nineveh, that would be the same thing because it's talking about Yahweh's message to the Ninevites, right? But when you talk about the prophecy of Jonah as a book, you're talking about a more generic sort of composition. That is saying this is a book that is prophetic because it's about a prophet and it contains oracles and so forth.
Okay. So would it be then more accurate to say that prophecy is more of the office or the person that is, as Jonah put it, a slave to the word of God or to God, Yahweh?
I would think that prophecy is describing the phenomenon by which God reveals himself to individuals with messages, right? Oracle would be the specific message that comes at a particular point in time to be delivered.
Okay.
And the word prophet then describes the human person who is the agent of Yahweh to present the message, the oracle, to the audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's the more I see them, the more clear it will come. But thanks for your time. I will let you take your break.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll reconvene, please. So we're going to look at Jonah chapter 3. And then as we come to the end, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how would I try to prepare a sermon out of this material and give you a suggestion on some things. You all have your own individual style of preaching and sermon development. So this is not to say this is how you have to do it, but it's just an example of one attempt to say, okay, what's the big question and how can we perhaps organize a presentation around that and in response to that big question. So yesterday you took some time to look at the prayer psalm in Jonah chapter 2, and it raises all sorts of really interesting questions, but is also a very poignant expression of Jonah's repentance and acknowledgement of Yahweh and the fact that he is doing as he pleases. To what degree this really represents a fundamental shift in Jonah's attitudes, of course, comes out in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Because even though in chapter 2 he is very clear, verse 9, with the voice of thanksgiving, with sacrifice to you, what I have vowed I will pay, same kind of stuff that we found with the pagan sailors and so forth, an acknowledgement that deliverance belongs to Yahweh. Does that really resonate with him when we come to his actions in chapter 3 and chapter 4? You might ask the question, are there other places in the Old Testament where you get this interaction between prose and poetry? I don't know whether you talked about that a little bit yesterday. Okay, so I won't go there. In Exodus, to my mind, the big example of that is Moses' Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, in response to the historical events in chapter 14, and so forth. The narrative then, when we come to chapter 3, begins with a rehearsal of the oracle. Now, to give you sort of a brief idea of what was sort of going on in Assyria at this point, we do have what is called a list of events in Assyria in the years 765 to 759, which is roughly contemporary with the time of Jonah, if we accept what the narrative is saying. And the list is interesting. In 765, there was a plague. In 763 and years following, there were revolts. There was a solar eclipse in 763, which always created deep anxiety. There was famine from 765 to 759. In other words, things were not easy in Assyria at this period. It wasn't a happy time. There were all sorts of things going on that created disruption and so forth. And so that suggests that the message that Jonah is going to bring comes into a period of Assyrian history that was kind of disjointed and disrupted by many different calamities. Now, as we think about the oracle, you'll notice that it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying. And the language that's used here is very similar to what we found in chapter 1 and verse 1. So the oracle is at the beginning. Then we have in the chapter a brief description of Jonah's response, and then a description of how the Ninevites respond to the message. And it ends finally with Yahweh's response. When you compare the flow of action in chapter 3 to the flow of action in chapter 1, you can see some similarity, right? If you, instead of the sailors, you put in the Ninevites, excuse me, then you still have Yahweh and Jonah and this group of pagans. And you have the oracle, you have Jonah's response to the oracle, and then you have the Ninevites' response to the message, and then you have Yahweh's final action. Very similar flow to things. And this might then suggest that there's some kind of parallel that the writer is wanting to suggest between the pagan sailors and their response to the situation and the Ninevites and their response to the situation, and how Yahweh treats both of these groups of pagan people. Now, things move very quickly because, again, we have a very short narrative in Jonah. So the writer doesn't have a lot of space to sort of divert attention or to fill in the gaps and this kind of thing. And so we have the commission of Jonah in verse 2, get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you. Now, we don't have the oracle yet. We have a commission, okay? But we don't yet know what the message is going to be. But we have the same sort of terminology, get up, go, arise, go, as we found in chapter 1 and verse 2, and so forth. So there's this repetition indicates, okay, God's dealt with Jonah. Jonah's come to the point that he's ready to go. God has preserved him. He's gone all through this experience. Now we sort of get, okay, reset, okay? We're going to go back and start again, as it were. But this is the second time, right? And we then have Jonah responding positively this time. So verse 3, he sets out, and he went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. So instead of arising and fleeing, he arises and goes, and he obeys according to the word of the Lord. So we assume that Jonah's learned something, right? His experience has impressed upon him that it's futile to try to avoid what Yahweh is seeking to do. So there's been some learning, however painful it might have been and however costly it was, both to the pagan sailors who lost their cargo and so forth, and Jonah who's gone through this terrifying experience. And so now he acts according to the word of the Lord. And then we get this little bit of background information about Nineveh, because we haven't heard anything about Nineveh. And so the writer has to share something so the audience understands a little bit about, how should I say, the significance of what Yahweh is doing here. So Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days walk across, and Jonah began to go into the city going a day's walk. So the immensity of the city is emphasized here. Nothing is said about its Assyrian connections. All of that is assumed. Nothing is said about its interactions with Israel and the northern kingdom. All of that is assumed and so forth. But just that it's a huge city with a large population and so forth. But again, it raises the question, why is Yahweh concerned with a pagan city? What would this kind of activity raise in the minds of an Israelite audience? And so I think this is one of the things to keep in mind as we go forward through this particular segment. Why Nineveh? Why this pagan city? And why is Yahweh even concerned? Jonah then delivers Yahweh's message in verse 5. And we get a little more detail here, 4 and 5. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's the oracle. Now, when you go back to chapter 1 and verse 2, we've got the commission, go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. We didn't have time to go into that idea about human wickedness coming to Yahweh's attention, right? Very similar to what you read at the beginning of Exodus, where Yahweh in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, says that he is aware of the cry of Israel that's arisen to him because of the enslavement and the oppression of the Egyptians. Here it's a little bit different. Here it's more like Sodom and Gomorrah, where their wickedness has risen up before Yahweh, and he's going to take action against them. Pagan cities, filled with evil, and so forth. When you go a little bit further into the situation of Nineveh and so forth, it says in verse 8, they turned from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. So this is presumably the reason why Yahweh is judging them and is going to come against them. We often wrestle with the issue of the Canaanites and Israelite occupation of the land, and God, threatening to throw them out of the land and destroy them, and the mandate to Israel to go in and cleanse the land and so forth, and why that would be the case. What have they done that would result in such a dramatic response from Yahweh? Well, maybe it's similar. It's their evil, their violence, and this is what prompts then Yahweh's activity and so forth. But the judgment of God is always a difficult message to proclaim and to understand. But here I think we get some sense of how Yahweh is perceiving the situation and why he is going to act. What is, I think, interesting is he gives time for their response. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be destroyed. Now, it raises the question, as I indicated yesterday, why would the great people of Nineveh, part of this great empire who have their own gods, pay any attention to a message from a minor deity worshipped by a very small regional group of people, and so forth? What catalyzes the Ninevites to really listen to Yahweh? Just as the pagan sailors, what catalyzes the pagan sailors to pay attention to Yahweh and his message? In verses 1 to 4, all the verbs are past tense except for the verb in verse 3, which of course is indicating that Nineveh is this background, the background information about Nineveh. You have again the subject verb word order here about Nineveh being the great city and so forth. And then of course we have the message in verse 4 and 5 and so forth. Now just a question. This is the first time we read about the 40 days. And one of the things in the narrative is to think, when did these 40 days start? 40 days more, it says here, at least in the English version. In the Hebrew text and so forth, in terms of the end of verse 4, you have a particle, oath, which means again, or yet, or more, and then you have 40 days. So you have what is called a verbless clause. 40 days, again, 40 days, more, 40 days still. It's not exactly clear what the 40 days means. Is it 40 days from the time of the second oracle? Is it 40 days from the time of the first oracle? When did the clock start ticking? If it started ticking when God gave the first oracle, because it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, then time's even shorter than the 40 days, because a lot of time's been taken up with the storm and the fish and all of that escapade. So what's left? How soon is the judgment coming? Or is it 40 days from the time when Jonah actually expresses the oracle? It's a bit of a question there. I wonder, in the flow of the narrative, whether the response of the Ninevites to the oracle indicates that time is short. In other words, they don't have 40 days. It's more like 3 or 4 days, maybe, that's left. How long would it take Jonah to travel from the Mediterranean coast to Nineveh? You know, if we think historically, right? If we think that this text is telling something about the way it is. It probably is a journey of 500 or 600 miles. And if you think 20, 30 miles a day maximum, you know, you're 30 to 35 days of travel from that period. So 40 days, you're left with 5 or 6 days at the most. And he travels 3 days' journey into Nineveh before he actually expresses the oracle. So the clock's ticking, perhaps. Right? Now, I don't, again, want to make a big thing of this, but it's interesting to me that in the Greek version of this oracle and so forth, it doesn't say 40 days, it says 3 days. Now, there's no way that the translator could misread the Hebrew number 40 for the Hebrew number 3. So the translator is obviously making an intentional change. And the translator is, in my view, accommodating the fact that the oracle was stated in chapter 1 and verse 2, 40 days. Then we got Jonah doing all his stuff. Time's been ticking. The journey to Nineveh. And by the time he gets there and makes the oracle, 3 days are left. So in the Greek translation, the Ninevites don't have a lot of time to decide what to do. Right? I don't know if that's a true interpretation of the Hebrew text, but it's a possible one. And so I just mention that to you as, again, a way in which people have understood what's going on in Jonah chapter 3. So if Yahweh remained true to his prediction, the Ninevites then don't seem to have a great amount of time to respond. We've talked a little bit about the description of Nineveh already in verses 2 and 3. The term, it is a great city, is interesting. In the NRSV, it just says, now Nineveh was an exceeding large city. The Hebrew text in verse 3 says something a little different. It says, now Nineveh was a great city for God. And the reason that it's translated just as now Nineveh was an exceeding large city is that the scholars argue that the reference to God here is a way of making a superlative. It was large with reference to God's perspective of largeness. But there is another way to read it, and that is to read this phrase as a statement of Yahweh's concern. It was a great city with reference to God. In other words, God knew it was a great city. And so this is what, in some ways, motivating him to take action. So again, here you have a bit of an interpretational issue. Is the writer here making some statement about Yahweh's care for the city, concern for it in some way, the value that Nineveh has in God's eyes? Or is it just kind of a superlative expression? A city of divine proportions, something like that. Okay. Anyway, just another little wrinkle. Now, in the chapter then, verse 5, we have the response of the people. We have the response of the king and his nobles in verse 6, the decree in verse 7, and then the description of the confession, the waiting, the hoping in verses 8 and 9. All of this involved with the response of the people. So the bulk of the chapter is given over to describing how the population responds to God's ultimatum. And then in verse 10, we have God's response to Nineveh's response, and so forth. So looking at this in just a little more detail, it says that in verse 5, the people in Nineveh believed God. Now, this word believe is always a bit tricky in Scripture because it can mean believe in the sense of regard as true. It can mean believe in the sense of put faith and trust in, and so forth. It can mean believe in the sense of, how shall I say, accept as the framework for life or something like it. It has multiple perspectives and so forth. So what is it that the Ninevites did here in verse 5 when it says that they believed God? Notice that it doesn't say Yahweh, it just says that they believed God. Any suggestions? How much do we read into this word believe here?
Maybe they believed the words of Jonah,
Okay. So
they just listened to him.
Okay. So the idea is they believed in the sense of regarding as true. This is going to happen, so we need to do something. Okay. Anyone else?
I think the fact that the next part is they called a fast and put on sackcloth explains a little bit about their belief too.
Okay. So they believed and regarded it as true in the sense that they were willing to radically change their behaviors and so forth. So it's not just a, how shall I say, a passive acceptance of something as true, i.e. the sun comes up in the morning and travels and goes over at night and so forth, as a kind of truth, generality. But this is something that stimulates them into action. It's a belief that generates transformational change. Whether it is saving faith is, I think, an interesting question. And perhaps we'll have to wait then until we come to look at what they actually did in order to evaluate that. Just again remind you that in verse 1 of chapter 1, the patronymic of Jonah, Amittai, is related to the same verb, believe. Okay, so Amittai means believing in Yahweh. And so to believe God, similar kind of language and so forth. I wonder what Jonah said that indicated that this destruction is going to be caused by deity and not by some natural phenomenon or army. In other words, all it says is 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's very succinct. Doesn't say how, doesn't say who's going to do this, doesn't say what's going to happen. It's just city's going to be destroyed. So what other information, I wonder, did Jonah provide that indicated that this is indeed a divine destruction which required a religious response, not a military response? Okay? Because if it was 40 days and the armies of Babylonia are going to come and attack you, okay, that would require a different kind of response. But as someone said, their reaction in verse 6 indicates that they understand this to be a divine action. And so it calls for a religious kind of response in that way. And so in verse 6 then, we have what they do. And it says that verse 5, they proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. Now, you're familiar with the use of sackcloth to indicate mourning, and so it's a sign of repentance, a sign of humbling. All of those elements come in, and the fasting and all of that, again, is usually associated with repentance and sorrow, something of that nature. And so their actions indicate some kind of repentant resolution, indicating that they have accepted the truth of the oracle. They have acknowledged that presumably Yahweh is behind it, and they are now appealing in this way for him not to do this. And so their action is intended, I presume, to show on the one hand their repentance, and on the other hand, it is an appeal for relief from the sentence and so forth. It's interesting that nothing is said about their gods or anything of that nature. It just said that they believed God, and then this is what they did. Just like with the pagan sailors, they come to a resolution that this is a Yahweh event, and so they needed to attend to Yahweh. So here, the Ninevites attend to Yahweh. In verse 6, the response of the king, again, it's a little bit ambiguous. When the news reached the king, is this news of Jonah's oracle, or is it news of the response of the Ninevites? Again, the text is a little bit ambiguous. But he parallels the response of the Ninevites, right? He arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, sat in ashes. It's even more extreme to a certain extent, right? In terms of the degree of humility that he expressed in the face of this oracle. The decree that he makes, along with his nobles, no human being or animal or herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. So here for the first time we have an elaboration, as it were, of what human response is required in the face of such divine judgment. And it seems to me that the actions and so forth here are quite all-encompassing, right? It changes the whole life pattern of these people. Now, just a small thing. Can humans exist without water for 40 days? No. So maybe we have a little clue here that the 40 days started ticking back in chapter 1. And if you have 3 days left, well, that's manageable, right? But unless you believe that the story is entirely fictive, and so this is kind of an exaggerated element in the story or something like that. But this may be a small indicator that the time left is short, and it requires this very drastic kind of action. It's not just a fasting from food, but it's a fasting from water, right? Nothing can be more drastic. Total non-consumption, which inevitably will result in death. Okay? Because if you take that to its limit, no one will survive. The crying out to Yahweh, right, in verse 8 and so forth, crying mightily to God, indicates the seriousness of this particular action. But we come to sort of the $64,000 question in verse 9. God may relent, change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. And this brings to light sort of the whole question. Does God change his mind? Does God repent, as it were? Now, there are several verbs here that are important to understand so that we grasp a little bit of what's going on. So the first part, you have this question. And the nature of the question is kind of a expression of uncertainty. We don't really know, right? But maybe this will cause the deity to change his mind. So I don't think they've had instructions from Jonah about what to do in order to have Yahweh change his mind. This is their response, presumably similar to the kinds of response that they're used to in terms of propitiating or appeasing the gods, but they don't know. They have no assurance that this will result in forgiveness. So, getting to this language then, who knows whether Ha-Elohim, the God, and the first verb here means to either be sorry, to be remorseful, be consoled, some idea of comfort, all right? And I think the idea here is that the deity, having seen what the Ninevites do in response to his message, as comfort, all right? That they've heard and they've responded. Not so much that he's repented. And he may then turn from, as it were, the anger that he has expressed. In other words, the consolation or comfort is related to the anger that he has expressed. And I think those two things need to be held together in the light of the response of the Ninevites. And so as a result, he will not destroy us. Okay? So, question is, how indeed does God do this, right? I provided here in the PowerPoint the Hebrew text here and underlined the verbs. First of all, who knows, whether or not he may relent and he may change, etc., etc. And this language here, the verb here is yashuv, and shuv is the Hebrew word that often describes human repentance, human turning. Okay? Who knows whether he will turn? And this is the verb, the next verb here, naham, whether the deity Ha-Elohim will experience consolation, will experience comfort at what you're doing. And then the verb is repeated here, vashav, whether he will turn, etc. So you have the repetition of this verb, whether God may turn, etc. Now I know in the English there are several different verbs used here. Who knows, God may relent, yeshuv, and change his mind, nacham. He may turn, vishav, from his fierce anger, so that we do not perish. What I just want to emphasize here is that the English is putting a bit of an interpretation upon the repetition of the verbs here, in my opinion. It may be correct, but I'm just saying the Hebrew just repeats the verbs. And so the idea here is that God may turn, i.e., he may change, because he has received some consolation, and so then may feel that he can turn from his fierce anger. The response of the Ninevites are key to Yahweh's response that happens. I give you a little more information there about the Greek, but we won't go into that as time is going here. Okay? And so we then come to Yahweh's response in verse 10. And it says, when Ha-Elohim, when God saw their actions, and how they shavu, how they turned from their way, their wicked way, then God, and we have the repeated verb here, Yinaham, God was consoled, or perhaps changed his mind regarding the calamity which he said he was going to do to them, and he did not do it. So the language that is used in verse 9 about turning and relenting or consoling, being consoled, is repeated then in verse 10. God changed his mind, God turned from the calamity, and God relented, God, as it were, was consoled about what was going to happen. And so he did not do it. Now the big question often in theology is, does God really change his mind? Does God repent? All right? And I think putting the question that way does not really help us. I think what we have here is the Ninevites, having heard the oracle of God, responding in repentance, and Yahweh in turn granting forgiveness. And the way in which he grants forgiveness is that he is consoled so that his anger is, as it were, appeased by their repentance. And so he does not exercise the divine justice that otherwise he had determined. And it is the human response that is the activating element in leading Yahweh to alter his decision. So this again comes back to chapter 1. Yahweh does as he pleases. Okay? He is the one in charge, and he can change and he can alter things because of human response. And I think this is part of the message here that is important. Now, the Ninevites here, we are told, do not offer any kind of sacrifice or anything of that nature. They've expressed their repentance through fasting, sackcloth, humiliating themselves, and so forth. And perhaps this is in line with Micah 6, where Micah says, it's not the sacrifices of animals and the pouring out of blood and oil and so forth that appeases God. It's human obedience to his command. That's what brings forgiveness and mercy and so forth. And perhaps we see here those elements at work in the context of chapter 3 as the Ninevites respond. When you go into chapter 4, and Dr. Kim will review this with you, you'll notice that in verse 2, the narrative through the mouth of Jonah recites the great creed of Israel, that Yahweh is a gracious God and merciful, it's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. That's an addition, all right? But obviously it's used there because of what happened in chapter 3. And it raises the interesting question of what is the writer wanting to say about that addition to the great creed of Israel. So just very briefly, if you'll give me 5 minutes, and then we'll end talking a little bit about how then do we take something out of this text and try to fashion a message, a lesson, a Bible study, and so forth. In my opinion, when you come to thinking about sermon preparation, you always have to try to discern what's the core thesis. What's the relevant subjects? What are the data points and applications and illustrations that will generate the response you're looking for from the audience? To my mind, you always have to ask, how will the message I present generate a transformational response in the life of the audience? Because that's the whole purpose of what we're doing, right? And so there's kind of three focuses for me. First of all, at the top, what ideas is the text generating? Out of all the multiplicity of those ideas, which one am I going to focus on? What ideas in the text are speaking to my personal situation? Because in a sense, preaching and teaching is always somewhat autobiographical, because you have to be affected by the message as much as the audience, and you're speaking out of that interaction with the text. And then thirdly, what ideas in this text will speak to what you know about the personal needs in the congregation individually or the congregation as a whole? What do they need to hear from God in this message, and so forth? And those three focuses are always at play, in my opinion, when it comes to trying to generate a sermon. What is the text saying? What is the text saying to you? What is the text possibly contributing to the lives of the congregation? And so I want to read the text in a valid way to make sure I understand what the big ideas really are. I want to do the hard work to bridge the gap between culture and time personally, because I'm so far removed from these events. And then I need to make sure I'm understanding my audience. Do I really know what's going on, and what is the spiritual message or ethical message or other message that they need to hear? And so when I think about the ideas, I'm primarily asking the question, what's Yahweh doing in this text? What does it tell me about his purposes, his character, his engagement, and so forth? And when I think about my own engagement with what I'm learning out of the text, what is it telling me about the mystery of life and how it intersects with divine purposes? How do I understand life better? And my own sense of what's going on in the world through this text. And then the collective responsibility that we have as the people of God for discerning and obeying God's will. How is that going to be activated in a witnessing kind of context in the life of the congregation? So that's a very short summary, but that's how I sort of look at sermon preparation. I'm not a homiletician. Others who speak on these questions will have a much more profound, I'm sure, understanding of things, but that's my very simplistic understanding of things. So these three factors then, yourself, the audience, the text, bridging the gap, and the big ideas that you want to try to wrestle with in the text. So what are the big ideas in chapters 1, 2, and 3 that we might think about? One might be, can we know God's purposes personally, collectively, historically? What do we know actually about what God is about? Is Yahweh, if he's sovereign, what influence might humans have on his actions? Can we change the actions of God? You think about the sailors, think about the Ninevites, how they acted to change the outcome of destruction. Right? What is Yahweh's mission for his people? And how did they serve as his agents? What about Jonah? How does divine forgiveness work? And why is it necessary? It's kind of intriguing. You have pagans who are the ones that are experiencing forgiveness, chapter 1 and 3. You have Jonah presumably experiencing some forgiveness in chapter 2. But how does it work? What does a human have to do in order to receive forgiveness from Yahweh? What does fear of God entail? And is it still relevant for humans today? Does fear of God have any place in the gospel? What happens when people live in ignorance of God intentionally or unintentionally? So those are just some questions. You would amass your own list of big ideas as you are reflecting on the text. And then sort of shaping this, the big question I chose: what does it mean to fear God, and why is this response foundational to any relationship with Yahweh even today? And trying to base that out of Jonah chapter 3, 1 to 10, and the response of the Ninevites, and so forth. When I prepare a sermon, I always try to establish the question: what is it I'm trying to answer? What question am I trying to answer? And then I try to say, okay, as a result of this sermon, what do I expect will happen in the life of the audience? And I always try to state that as clearly as I can, because that then becomes a guide to how I develop the sermon. So here I'm suggesting I want the audience to be able to explain what fearing Yahweh means, both in terms of the Old Testament and New Testament. That's one of my goals. I want them to be able to discern in what way accepting Jesus as Savior is the appropriate way today to fear Yahweh. To discern what a beneficial and love-filled life has, fearing Yahweh as its proper foundation. And to understand that being a disciple of Jesus is all about fearing Yahweh. And this gives my presentation some structure, because if I'm not going to be able to get them to that point, then in my view, the sermon has not succeeded. So the introduction, I try to introduce the big question: where does fear of Yahweh come into the narrative, and so forth? How does the narrative bring this issue to the fore? And so I would talk a little bit about Jonah 1:16. What is it to fear Yahweh with a great fear? Why is that a positive thing? And so forth. Because fear today is usually viewed as a negative thing. But within the text, fearing Yahweh is the ultimate response that Yahweh is looking for, it seems. Jonah claims to fear Yahweh, but does he really? Do his actions align with his confession? What leads the pagan sailors to fear Yahweh? To shift from fearing the storm to fearing Yahweh. After Yahweh preserves the city of Nineveh, does Jonah truly express fear of Yahweh? And so what does it mean to fear Yahweh, and why is this response foundational in any relationship with Yahweh even today? And so that leads to four sort of things. What did fearing Yahweh entail for the pagan sailors? And sort of working on that and elaborating that and so forth. And out of that, trying to get some definition. What does fearing Yahweh really entail? And so recognizing who he is as creator of heaven and earth, recognizing accountability to Yahweh, recognizing what loyalty to Yahweh looks like, believing Yahweh's messages, just like the Ninevites did, and so forth. Second section, how do we understand the biblical requirement to fear Yahweh with the declaration by the Apostle John that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear? For the mistake, has to do with punishment. So how do we help Christians today understand this apparent tension between fearing Yahweh and experiencing the love of God? Because these are often viewed as totally contrary elements. You cannot have fear of God and have love of God. And I don't think that's what the Bible teaches. So again, you got to help the audience understand that a little bit, and so forth. So how do the sailors move from fearing the storm to greatly fearing Yahweh and accepting him as their creator God and offering him the respect that he deserves? And what about Jonah? How does that work with Jonah and so forth? And then in the gospel, where Jesus invites us to fear Yahweh, but within the declaration of divine love, as we find in John 3:16. And this leads then finally to the faith response, all right, in terms of fearing Yahweh in the gospel context is a response of putting faith and trust in Jesus Christ. And talking a little bit about some of the New Testament context, talk about fearing God in the context of gospel. Third section, fearing God, is one of the four ways that 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17 talks about in terms of expressing submission to God. Fear God, honor the king, love one another, etc. Right? You've got those imperatives, but fear God is one of the requirements that is set out for believers. And talking a little bit about that in terms of the Ninevite response, replacing their evil ways and violence and demonstrating kindness and so forth. And then finally, arguing that being a disciple of Jesus means properly fearing Yahweh all your life. And how does that get expressed and so forth. And then concluding perhaps with a little bit of a reflection on the visions of Jesus and God in Revelation and emphasizing their fearsome, awesome, and incomparably great power, glory, and wisdom that's revealed, and the response of the elders and the angels and the multitudes who bow down and so forth. How does this express the fear of Yahweh but love for him and so forth? So that's how I would try to take one of the ideas in Jonah and try to fashion then a sermon that bridges between the Old Testament and New Testament, because the theme of fearing Yahweh runs across them all. And in a way is a way of describing every appropriate human response to Yahweh, whether it's in the context of the Old Testament covenant or in the context of the new covenant that Jesus has established in and through his own life and death. So I'm going to stop there. Any response, questions that you have just before we wrap up this session?